This podcast is brought to you by Turncast. We make game-changing content for fintech and financial services companies. Learn more at turncast.com.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Connected. I'm your host, Kyle Van Pelt, CEO of Mile Marker, and today I am joined by Frazer Rice. Frazer's the Director of Family Office Services at Next Capital Management, and he's the founder of Wealth Actually, where he also has his own sweet podcast. Go check that out. It's a good one. And he wrote a great book, one that I enjoyed very much. It's called Wealth Actually, with a lot of really awesome sort of narrative focused stories on how people are approaching wealth and things like that. I loved Frazer's book. You should go check it out. After being named a rising star in the industry years ago, he has blossomed into a full-blown star, particularly as it pertains to creative, ultra-high net worth trust and estate planning strategies that we'll talk about today. But outside of all of that, Frazer is involved in film creation. He's an avid golfer, and he has an affinity for great storytelling. Frazer, did I miss anything in that intro?
I don't think so. I'm sure I could discover something else, but that's enough to go on.
You are a man of many different things that we're going to dive into today. I got to know you through the wealth management industry, but before we even dive into that, we're filming this shortly after Duke just took down Clemson in football, and I mean, huge win. So that was their first victory, Duke's first victory over a top 10 team since 1989. And that's got to be exciting for you.
Thrilled. We have a really good quarterback in Riley Leonard. Our coach, Mike Elko, looks like a real keeper. We were good last year. We finished 9-4, but the sort of operating idea was that we might be a better team this year, but have a worse record. And I don't think anybody really viewed us as being too competitive against Clemson. And I think the really shocking part was Duke played far less than a perfect game and came out on top, and team speed and toughness and all that was commensurate with, a real national power program. So
yeah.
Alumni are thrilled, and the hype machine is rolling. Hopefully we'll be 4-0 going up against Notre Dame.
Yeah. I mean, it's a fun time, right? And not to be too cheesy on the connection here, but I feel like Duke's football program has been like compound interest, because obviously Duke's always been this huge basketball school, but like I feel like Duke's football program has just, slowly been stair-stepping their way up to more national recognition, better records, solid team. I mean, they've been more in the spotlight, at least from where I'm concerned, over the past maybe 5-7 years, and just incrementally getting better every single year.
Well, we've had some real dry patches, that's for sure. And, as you know, with college football, it really relates to coaching and recruiting. You can't win without talent. And we've had some stretches where we just didn't have that. David Cutcliffe, who was Mike Elko's predecessor, did a really good job revitalizing the program. And then it sort of leveled off at the end, and Elko was brought in. Nobody really knew about him, and the reviews are glowing, obviously. And I don't think there could be much more excitement than right now.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's got to be fun to be a Duke fan right now.
Yep.
So I kind of talked about, I mean, you're somewhat of a Renaissance man. You're involved in film, you're involved in writing, not just your Wealth Actually book, but you've written a graphic novel. You've been involved in politics. You've been involved in all kinds of things. So there's lots of ways that this podcast could go. But I actually want to start on the film side of things, and we'll maybe work our way into the wealth management stuff. But where does your love for film come from? And then specifically, I know you love the horror genre.
Right.
So, maybe talk about that. Like, where does the love for film come from, and specifically horror?
Well, I'm a Gen Xer. I just turned 50, so I'm of a certain vintage where I was somebody who, was planted in front of the TV for a while and just absorbed as much media as possible, whether it's music videos, big comic book fan, and horror movies and things like that. So I just grew up with it. I think horror is interesting to me because oftentimes people who enjoy it are a little weird. And so I put myself in that category too. But also the space is interesting because oftentimes you have strange concepts, outlandish situations, scenarios where you normally wouldn't be in. So it's kind of fun to transport yourself somewhere that you're not trying to run away from Jason Voorhees or something like that. But from a pure filmmaking standpoint, a lot of times the budgets around these are minimal. The talent around it is compromised in one way or the other. And the filmmakers have to try to solve a problem, which is how to get somebody invested and scared. And I find it very interesting to really see how that gets achieved. And sometimes you can see some real ingenuity that then translates into broader storytelling later. A director like Sam Raimi is a great example of that, where he basically for nothing created Evil Dead and then Evil Dead 2. And then, suddenly people saw the ingenuity and everything like camera techniques and his way that he drove a story and incorporated humor. And suddenly he's helming the Spider-Man franchise. It's also, horror movies are a great way to discover whether young actors can carry a movie. And it's usually, their first bite at the apple on that. There's dozens and dozens and dozens of examples, but, everyone sort of forgets that Steve McQueen's first starring role was in The Blob back in the 50s. And in many ways, when you look back at his career, you can always go back to say, you know what, you could tell that this guy could carry a movie. And that's why it's an interesting venue for a lot of people. And that's where my interest comes from it.
That's awesome. I mean, it's well thought out, right? And I think that's pretty cool. And then you got to have a neat experience of actually being in a horror movie.
That's right.
So talk to us about that a little bit. You actually got to act in a horror movie, and I think there was a little bit of a plot twist there, right?
Yeah. So a friend of mine was directing a horror movie, and he asked me to help him on various fronts, and I kept saying no, 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 no. And finally, after the 15th ask, I said, okay, but my price is I get to die in the first scene. So it's called The Devil's Restaurant. You can see it on Amazon. It's out there, and I'm strapped to a chair, and my face or my mouth is duct taped, so I don't have any lines. It underscores the fact that movie making is extremely hard work, and it's, acting is not for sissies. I didn't have anything to do. The poor guy who was the lead in it had sort of this 30-second monologue in a trailing camera shot. And you had to practice it because ultimately I get thrown into a closet and then gored by demons and 40 gallons of blood come flying out. Yeah, we really only could take one take though, because if you screwed up and all the corn syrup came flying out, you had to go and clean it up again to do take two. So my 30 seconds on screen took, I think it was 4 or 5 hours to do because we kept
oh my goodness,
practicing and practicing and practicing so we didn't screw it up. But boy, it was a lot of fun. And, maybe someday I have one IMDb credit. Hopefully I can maybe get a couple more before I kick off the mortal coil.
Yeah, man, what a story. I was going to ask because, in so many movies, especially in the horror genre, there's always that character that you love and they come on and you're like, oh, I really like this character. We all know they're going to die very early in the film, right? Like the beloved characters never make it. So I was going to say, was Frazer the character? We didn't even have any lines to make people love you. You were just there to die.
No, I was I was slasher fodder or demon fodder as it was. So every good horror movie has a little bit of that in it, I guess.
Yeah, incredible, man. Well, speaking of horror, I want to talk about the thread of your career, and not that your career has been a horror film, but you've been wrapped up in law and politics, and then some of the wealth management stuff. I mean, there's a lot of things a lot of people wouldn't want to touch with a 10-foot pole, yet you went headlong into all of them. So talk to us, kind of about that journey. Why law? Why politics? And then how did you ultimately end up here in the wealth management family office space?
Sure. So basically, when I was in college, I ended up working for a gubernatorial campaign in New York. I think politics and policy really engages sort of the wonky aspect of my brain that I enjoy. Sort of the fundraising aspect of it is a little more unseemly and so on. But that's how I started. I guess politics in many ways is my first love. And so I got started with that. That turned into a job up in Albany, New York for the Department of Economic Development, which was a lot of fun. It was a great way to be involved in the policy aspects, trying to sort of create and keep jobs in New York State, which is tough work given the economic climate. But at the same time, I realized I didn't want to be a civil servant my whole life or a political operative necessarily. There's certain trade-offs with that. And so I did what other lost souls do, and I went to law school. And I went down to Emory, and so lots of experience down in Atlanta. I went into it knowing that I didn't necessarily have to be a lawyer per se, that the education itself had a lot of value to it, different way to think, different way to attack problems, confidence in front of other highly accomplished people, the ability to ask good questions to get what you want when you need it. And I had kind of a really good smattering of experiences around it. I was able to work at the SEC down in Atlanta and the Federal Reserve. So the banking law and financial services aspect was something that I got a lot of exposure to. I ended up working at the House Banking Committee in Washington my second summer. I worked for an entertainment lawyer in Atlanta, which was a lot of fun. A really nice guy named Cliff Levette, who represents a lot of hip hop artists. So that sitcom is its own thing that could write itself, where you drop me into a room with a bunch of hip hop artists trying to navigate contracts and things like that. But all of that was just sort of just attacking different things that I was interested in. And, I sort of took things like the entertainment law experience and turned that into a law and economics paper around sort of the evolution of the music industry. And this was happening around the time when Napster was popularizing itself. And I just said to myself that, the idea of artists being completely beholden to record companies may change slightly and that they'll be taking more control themselves. That ended up being the case a little bit. Never really did anything with it, except that it's the type of thing that is useful when you reach out to different clients later on in the wealth management area. Fast forwarding a little bit, practiced law for a few years. The billable hour and I aren't very good friends in the sense that I marking my time and sort of understanding how things work in 5-minute increments drives me crazy, and it's just not the way I operate well. And the idea of going from A to B to C to D to E to F all the way to Z, sometimes I have trouble doing that. My brain sort of goes in different directions as I try to sort of absorb different things. But ultimately I moved over to wealth management. A fellow by the name of Tony Guernsey started Wilmington Trust's office up in New York. He liked the idea of lawyers as issue spotters. I hadn't been practicing law so long that my answer to everything was no or it depends, which can be very frustrating to people. And I got a great education there on how wealth management works. I really worked for a managing director for 5 years to understand how investing works, how trust and estates work, how to handle myself in front of wealthy people. Not that I didn't have experience with them before, but when you're providing a service to them and understanding what that's all about, that's a different thing entirely. And then I stayed at Wilmington Trust for almost 16 years. Part of the thread part, I think, also is a deep interest in the media. And, that's where the book writing and the podcasting and the film production and so on, that's always been the back there as well. So I have all these different threads that hopefully kind of weave together a little bit so that when I'm in front of people who have problems to solve, I have let's call it a multidisciplinary approach and experience in all those domains that help me identify and solve the problems. And then if I can't do it myself, I've got now a pretty broad and deep network that I can find the expertise to solve it and help direct traffic to make sure that once something's been set up to deal with something, that then it's administered and maintained correctly going forward and staffed correctly and all the different things that sort of line up with taking care of the details of someone's wealth position.
Yeah, it's a really storied way of getting here, but I also think it's hyper interesting, especially for what you do. To kind of recap what you said, because in most of the ultra high net worth space, it's not about asset allocation or any of those things. It really is about complex problem solving, right? I mean, in most cases, they could solve a lot of their problems with money, but then it's like you get to the problems that you can't solve with money. And all of a sudden it's like, hey, my experience with entertainment lawyers and all of these sort of things probably starts to be very relevant to how to help these people solve these problems.
Yeah, no question about it. I think that for whom retirement is the main thing that they're worried about. Do they have enough money to get to the end of their life comfortably? That's one analysis. When you start moving up the wealth chain and people start understanding that they have enough to spend during their lifetime and then their legacy going forward is what's important to them, that's when you start getting into a different level of discussion and framework building. That next generation legacy can be the continuation of their business. It can be making sure that their kids are taken care of and that they have the resources that they need to not only sort of enjoy life, but also be responsible adults. I think a lot of people in the ultra high net worth space operate in a world where they want to raise responsible people, and give them the resources they need to succeed, but not so much that they get spoiled. And so that's something that's a deep conversation that we have around. But also, part of legacy building is also impact on the different constituencies that have helped bring people along, either philanthropies or communities, businesses, et cetera, and helping understand what people want to affect and do differently. And then, the final step of it, in many ways, this is sort of what people normally think of with ultra high net worth planning, is the concept of tax planning and structure and trusts and LLCs and things like that. That almost to me is a continuation of hopefully a broader discussion with a family and patriarch, matriarch of, what they want to be, what they want to do, and what they want to leave behind. And then the structures, in a way, I'm not going to say they take care of themselves, but it certainly helps guide the discussion of what tools to use and how best to do things so that you're taking care of the goals that families like that have. And as you said, it's complex problem solving. It's a lot of emotion. It's a lot of personal dynamics. It's a lot of joint decision making. And many times the textbook answer or the most tax efficient answer isn't necessarily the one that gets the family where they want to go the best. And so that's something that you have to be able to deal with. And then, just on top of all that, aside from the personalities, the different kinds of assets and the different kinds of things that are important to people, that complicates or changes the nuance a little bit. And that's where hopefully having a deep and broad background helps to move that discussion along efficiently.
There's a lot to unpack there, and I want to get into some of the nuts and bolts about how you do that. But I'd be remiss if we didn't explore something you brought up in that answer, which is, the wealthy families and their kids. So I feel like this is a conversation that, I found myself having with other people, not that I'm necessarily in that situation yet, but I think a lot of people are concerned about, how do you raise kids when, it's like, how do we give kids experiences that, we can create for them without them being spoiled? That sort of, perpetual question of, how do we raise kids to appreciate what we have? I didn't have all of this growing up. It's different for them, all of those sort of things. Like, what have you seen in aggregate as you've looked across this as some ways that maybe people have done that well?
Sure. Well, I just to zoom out for a second, I think one of the telling statistics out there, or a bromide that is normally sort of associated with sort of the ultra high net worth, is that wealth is created and destroyed in 3 generations. It's often labeled shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves. It cuts across different cultures. So it's lily pad to lily pad in Asia, and shoe leather to shoe leather in 3 generations in England and other places. And so the idea is that the first generation makes it, the second generation sort of enjoys it, and then the third generation, which has been used to very sort of expensive tastes, but hasn't developed the toughness or the resolve or the grit to do it themselves, end up spending at a level that isn't supported by the wealth that is in place there. I think that there's sort of 2 components. The first one is that the idea that liabilities increase geometrically while assets in general increase linearly is in place. So there's going to be a delta between liabilities and asset growth. And so you're constantly fighting that equation. That said, I think something a trend that I think is a good trend, and hopefully it continues, is the idea that operating in fear of this shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves phenomenon and terrorizing families into action may not be the best course, because it creates a lot of sometimes overly rigid structures, et cetera. The idea of having positive discussions with families involving the next generation and beyond in the wealth, in the discussion, and most importantly, the communication around the wealth, is the path to creating and developing productive kids, productive generations, universal themes that are respected and celebrated within different constituencies and communities. And it really underscores, I think, it's a long-winded way of saying that, to me, the biggest threat to wealth isn't bad tax planning or investments. The ecosystem of smart people to solve those problems is broad and wide. But the biggest issue is communication, and it's amongst and between the generations. I think that liability to asset mismatch can be amplified if communication is difficult. And if you have siblings fighting, or you have baggage that accumulates over decades of people who were passed over or otherwise not really involved in the decision making, or maybe their first touch point with wealth is at the reading of the will and they are uneducated as to what a stock versus a bond is, that's where you really get into destructive situations. You get into arguments, and then ultimately the worst of all situations is litigation, when people understand that there's a legal system out there that's in place to defend different people's rights, and they're going to willing to spend what it takes to either defend themselves or, maybe worse, prove a point. And that's when big fortunes turn to small ones, turn to not much.
It is amazing that you continue to hear the stories, right, about are seemingly very happy families getting ripped apart when these things happen, and it's sad to hear, right? It's sad to hear, and so I think that's good insight, and a good segue into what you're doing at Next Capital. So you joined not long ago to spin up the Family Office Services department. So Next Capital was already an RIA being successful, but they saw this opportunity to spin up a family office services. Maybe just talk to people. I think everybody kind of conceptually understands what a family office is, but why would an RIA be starting a family office services line of business?
Lots of unpacking there too. So family office services in general is the concept of taking on a bunch of different roles that families need and require around the management of their wealth and their lifestyle, and giving them assistance in doing that. I think that the term family office gets sort of lumped in with lots of different functions, kind of like hedge fund or something like that, which means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Ultimately, I think what the presiding thought here with the group at Next and myself is that there's a lot of information and planning and structuring and administering that is being thought of and generated and created by lawyers and accountants, et cetera. And it ends up sort of stuck in between the ears of one or two people at the family level. And that in order to foster that good communication that I was talking about, in order to maybe mitigate the risks of wealth destruction elsewhere, and to help get the family members and other constituencies involved in the long-term direction of the wealth, I think the idea is to have assistance for the families, namely me, and what we can provide and support in helping people understand the structures and make sure that they're administered correctly. As an example, for instance, the idea of putting together a document that really underscores where the wealth is, what the structures are in place, who is staffing things, what happens when somebody passes away, who are the first phone calls to, who is directing traffic on that side of things. That's something that we're there to help assist with and to help families understand, and then to help communicate to the next generation and beyond. So that, again, the first real touch point on all this isn't at the reading of the will when the people are at maximum emotional stress and at maximum confusion as to how things work or don't work. We're there to try to assist along that line. Further to that point, it's really my job and the job of the firm to help the families identify the different issues that are out there, look around corners, look for opportunities either for tax savings or for structuring to further their goals, and also to watch out for different risks that are out there. An example, if someone sells a company and then all of a sudden they want to join a board, do they have the proper insurance to do that? Do they have the proper insurance around their properties when they have people visiting? The list goes on those types of things where there are different risks at play. Another good example would be the idea, sometimes things like good tax planning can be poor asset protection planning. So for instance, the idea of having, someone's company owning a car could be great tax planning. But if someone's teenage son then runs somebody over, that's horrible asset protection planning, because then you've just opened up the assets of the company to a potential lawsuit. It's our job to try to spot these types of issues, help families understand that, and then take steps to clean things like that up, and then make other things more efficient depending on what the family's looking to do.
Yeah, that's incredibly deep. And what I mean is just deeper than what I would have expected. And my mind just wonders to how much of this is an education exercise for you, versus how often are the families coming to you and saying, hey, do we have enough protection for, our residences when people are coming and visiting? Because I think these are things that I probably, wouldn't think of until somebody was like, hey, have you thought about this?
Well, I think from my perspective, it's a little bit of give and take. Some people are expert, for instance, someone, a small business owner or big business owner, they know more about their business than I'll ever know about. And so they'll know the risks that are pertinent to that. They'll know what the market value is. They'll have an idea of what's going on when they try to sell it. I'm there to try to help guide along the process as it relates to how to turn that business and make sure that it integrates well with their personal wealth and their estate planning and structuring and all that type of thing. By the same token, by having a broad experience with a trust company that's dealt with multiple generations of people, I've seen a lot of issues. And a lot of times these are issues related to grandkids, the business owners who are in their 40s, let's say. They just haven't had that. And that's the experience we try to bring to bear to help them think about these things so that when they make long-term decisions about how to structure different things, that we try to bring up some of these experiences so that they don't make the rookie mistakes that some people do and ultimately create, a gigantic toe stub that ends up being pretty expensive.
Well, I'm curious too. This is a dual question. I'm going to ask the first part of it, and then we'll go. But so you're standing up this line of business at Next Capital. At what level of wealth does it make sense to start employing a family office versus just a kind of a quote unquote traditional wealth management firm? And then I guess what I would even go beyond that is at what level of wealth is it, does it make sense to just have your own dedicated family office and not even work with, a firm like yours where you're running all of these things?
I'll answer it simply and then more in a more complicated way in a second. But the simple version is that I think the general wisdom is that at the 500 million level is when you can start thinking about hiring your own people to keep track of, invest, and distribute the assets and manage the spoils of what you're managing. And so if you sort of back into it and say, well, an accounting spine to keep track of everything, you're looking at a $200,000 a year person. They may need support, they need rent, they need that type of thing. That's one angle. Then you say, okay, if I want to bring the investment piece in-house, well, I'm going to need a CFA with experience in asset allocation and most likely vetting private deals and understanding that. That's probably a minimum kind of $400,000 type of person. And then the services that support that, the technology that supports that, and then the different administrative components in terms of, estate managers or concierge services, those types of things. It can get larded and very expensive very quickly. So in general, I think the family office, I put that in quotes. I think the general idea is 500 million is where that starts. Next, we think that there's a big need in the space between, let's call it taxable estates at the $25 million level up to that $300, $500 million level, where a firm out there who does a lot of these different things, you don't quite get there in terms of the services they provide. They are very interested in assets under management. Next is too. But the idea of having this dedicated business line to support this administration and family office service component is really, I think something that a lot of firms talk about, but have real difficulty implementing, because as we just sort of described, it's an expensive set of people to be able to do it well and to have the technology to be able to help provide the reporting and give the families ultimately what they want, and then being able to have those really high level discussions with the lawyers and accountants, et cetera, so that things not only get set up correctly, but that they get implemented 6 months after the fact, and then 5 years after the fact, that there is somebody out there at the firm level, namely me and Next, et cetera, when something happens, that there is a point of contact that understands in an extremely deep way what that is, what the impacts are going to be at that generation and flowing down. And then is there something to do going forward? And hopefully we're even more proactive than that, and that, if someone's having a child or getting married or getting divorced, that we're having those discussions so that we're way in front of it before it actually happens. And then, the surprises are kept to a minimum.
And then I would ask too, there's a lot of people who listen to this who run RIAs, even some of them rather sizable RIAs, and they may be thinking, hey, we have some clients in the range that Frazer just talked about. Maybe we should think about standing up a family office services business. What would you say, from your experience at Next, that those people should be thinking about if they wanted to stand up that type of line inside of their company and their firm?
Well, I don't want to give too much away so that the competition has a playbook, but I would say that I would be very careful and put a lot of forethought into the services that you want to provide and not provide. The idea of providing something like bill paying is sort of a low margin, high work, high liability aspect of the business. And it's something that we don't do, and I don't think we're going to get involved in that because there are other situations out there that provide that service. And that's an example where I'd say, I don't know, not so much. We've also made the decision, certainly for the short to medium term, not to have a trust company. I think there are many solutions out there to provide trustee services. I think it's important to say that, hanging up a family office services shingle should have a lot of forethought put into it in terms of the menu of services that you put yourself out there as providing, because once you sort of put it out there, then you have to do it. It can be, again, a best scenario, a low margin business, and then a worst solution scenario is, something that you telling a client you could do and then you couldn't, and then that's a problem.
All right. Well, and then let's look forward a little bit. So get out your crystal ball, and look a little bit, look a little bit into the future for us. Where do you see this industry going specifically for the ultra high net worth segment? I see, just to tee it up a little bit, there's been a lot of technology being created to help, call it tech enable, human driven things like estate plans and like tax preparation and all of these sort of things, the actual documentation of it. But then you get into everything you're talking about. It's like, okay, great. I've got the documents or I've got these sort of things in our grasp, but we still have to provide these services or things like that. So as you think about where things are going for the ultra high net worth segment, what do you think the future looks like?
It's a tough one. So I'll start with a couple things. The first is, I think technology will continue to help and enable the advisor class, of which I consider myself part of it, to help clients keep track of what they're doing, help them to vet opportunities, deal with risks, and chart a course going forward. I've surfed around lots of different software systems on lots of different things, and there is no one size fits all silver bullet that's going to solve everything. I think there is going to be a lot of manual labor, and in the ultra high net worth space, I think the idea that technology is going to solve everything, that's I think naive. I don't think that's going to be the case. I think from a few components, I think there's going to be a couple of thoughts here. The first one is that for certain functions, there's going to be a real premium placed on independence. As an example, the idea of having a trust company and an investment manager under the same roof is at times convenient in the first generation, and then at other times kind of gets rickety when you have future generations, especially if that wealth is centered around a specific asset. I think there are lots of interests and responsibilities that tug at providing true independent advice / administrative capabilities. The ultra high net worth space, a lot of the different gizmos that we think about and talk about deal with providing jurisdictional arbitrage for families. That is mostly in the form of either tax savings, asset protection, or flexibility in terms of structuring assets. To be wedded to a particular firm that does a lot of other things sometimes can put you at different odds with respect to the business model. Providing trustee services is different than providing AUM, which is different than providing lending. And sometimes I think it's nice to have the people operating in their own lane. And I think a lot of families are going to start demanding that even more than they already do. I think the examples of Silicon Valley Bank and First Republic, where the stability of larger institutions was sort of taken for granted, even after the lessons of 2008, and all of a sudden saying, oh my gosh, suddenly I've got major turnover, et cetera. The relationships I thought I had were out there. I think in the ultra high net worth space, the value of the relationship will continue to be important, and the scale of those institutions will continue to be important. But I think families understand that it's a good idea not to have all their eggs in one basket on important functions like trustee services and pure lending and things like that.
Yeah, that's interesting to hear you say, because, at Mile Marker, our business is trying to stitch together the independent silos that people use, right? And a lot of people are trying to figure out how to maybe centralize experience, but decentralize, their infrastructure in a lot of ways, which I think is interesting, because that's what you're saying here is, there might have been a trend for people to want to bring everything under one roof, but now you're still seeing, hey, these businesses that should have been very stable weren't as stable as we thought. So maybe we do diversify how the services are created, but we still don't want to have to go to 7, 8, 10 logins or, all of these types of things. So how do we centralize an experience while decentralizing the infrastructure? Is that kind of fair to say what you're stating as well?
Yeah, I think too that the concept of conflict of interest is out there. And I think that ultra high net worth families in particular are attuned to that. I mean, they see wealth managers and insurance people and all that, and they come with an agenda. And so when you start bundling functions under one institution, there may be some efficiencies in terms of fees, but there may be inefficiencies in terms of the focus and the ultimate agenda of the people providing that advice that have to be balanced. Sometimes it does make sense to have everything under one roof. It's just easier, potentially cheaper. At other times, you look at it and say, what investments are they offering me? Is this something that's off their shelf? Are they the best lender at the best rate? That type of thing. So I would say that the ultra high net worth space is even more attuned to conflicts of interest than maybe even 10 to 20 years ago.
That's been insightful. I think you brought some interesting perspective on a lot of that. That's different than what I typically hear. So shifting gears as we start to wrap up. I know you're an avid golfer. I am too. So I want to ask you, what are the top 3 courses you've played, and then what are your sort of top 3 remaining bucket list courses that you haven't been able to get out on yet?
It's like choosing between children. So I'm based in New York. We are thick with amazing golf courses around here. National Golf Links of America and Shinnecock out in Long Island are primo. Garden City is amazing. Wingfoot's amazing. I've already broken your 3 rule. At my home course, Bedford, I'd love to give it a shout out, because I think in many other states and places, it would compare very nicely. I enjoy things like Sankaty and Maya Comet up in Nantucket, all sorts of cool spots.
Northeastern golf is no slouch at all.
Not at all. So then the 3 that are off that I don't have in my achieved list, I'd love to play Cypress, Augusta, obviously, Alotian down in Arkansas. I've heard amazing things about the honors course in Tennessee. Hopefully I'll be getting on that someday, not too long in the future. And Sand Hills out in Nebraska apparently is a really special place. And then, that's the US. I'd love to go back over to Australia and play those, and Royal Melbourne and places like that. And then there's a bunch of European courses that are tip top as well.
Yeah, I love it. You can tell that you love it, right? You were just firing off the top of your head a bunch of places you'd still love to go.
To the detriment of my wallet, sadly.
Oh man, awesome. Well, Frazer, this has been an incredible conversation. You really brought a unique point of view for our audience, just as far as what the ultra high net worth segment looks like, what it's like to deliver quality family office services, and then obviously all of the fun conversations about the horror genre, about politics, about golf. I'm thankful that you decided to come and spend some time with us today.
Psyched to be on, Kyle, and watching everything that you're doing with great interest.
Yeah, thanks, man. Before we wrap up, is there anything that you want to shout out? And if not, where can people connect with you?
Sure. Well, so from a book perspective, you talked about it. Wealth Actually, you can find that on Amazon. Podcast is Wealth Actually. You can find that on the major platforms, Spotify, iTunes, etc. You can reach me easily at FrazerRice.com or at nextcapitalmgmt.com. And otherwise, if you Google Frazer Rice, you should be able to find me pretty quickly.
Perfect. And again, I said it in the beginning, I'll shout it out again. Frazer's book is great. Not to knock anybody else's, but it's not like just the typical finance book of, here's how all these things work. He tells great stories in there with the funny perspective that keep you interested in the in the lessons that he's teaching. Dare I say, it's almost, in a parable form. So I really recommend that you go check it out. and read it, especially if you're interested in any of these topics we talked about today.
Appreciate it. It was fun to write, and I'm thinking about a second one. So hopefully hopefully I can get good and fired up and get that pushed over the finish line.
Fantastic. Well, thanks again for joining. Everybody, this has been another episode of Connected. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we will see you on the next one.